Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to this first session in the breakouts of Cold Fusion Summit 2021. I'm glad to be here. My name is Charlie Arehart. I'll be your presenter for the next 50 minutes. And in this session, we're going to be doing hidden gems in Cold Fusion 2021 a year later. And as some of you know, I give this talk for every new version of CF, and it just so happens that this year there have been enough changes since it came out originally in November of last year that I proposed to do this talk, and they accepted it. So I'm grateful for that. Always a pleasure to be here at the CF Summit. This is I've been able to speak at every one since they started back in 2013. So thrilled to be able to keep that record going. So just there's my contact information there on the screen. You can see if you have any need to reach out to me about anything we talk about or anything else that I might help with. There's my email address, and then I'm easily reached in all the social media at, thankfully, very easy to remember, Arehart. All right. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, so what I want to clarify first is that these hidden gems talks, I do them and I call them hidden gems because they're not talking about all that's new in the new release. That would be too much to try to cover. So I'll note what the major new features are and point you to resources that cover those new things in more detail elsewhere. And really my focus is to highlight the less heralded things, the things you don't hear about talked about as much. And I group them into these broad areas. First, installation, administration, configuration, and monitoring. And that's important for this release because there's some very significant changes in this release related to those things. And then, of course, developers want to hear about what's the changes in the language and what are the new features that I can leverage. So we'll cover all those things in different levels of detail in this talk. And I will identify what's changed since I gave this talk at CF Summit 2020 last year. And then I'll touch on some other topics that everybody should always consider, like what's been deprecated and or removed since previous versions, what are the compatibility and migration issues as you move from older versions of CF to CF 2021. And then, as always, there's updates, and there have been 2 updates to CF 2021, and we'll talk about how things have changed since those updates came out. And also mention some JVM changes, because CF runs on top of the JVM, and you should be aware of things that might be significant and when the JVM changes, as well as when CF changes. And I'll cover a few more things that might be of interest to folks. There really is so much new in 2021 that I could talk about it. Others could talk about it all week. In fact, we've had the CF 2020 Summit and we had the Cold Fusion Developer Week earlier this year. So there are plenty of sessions where people go into much more depth of all the new features. So I gotta say, we'll have to leave it at that. So as far as the Summit 2020 and the Dev Week, I realized I didn't think to mention that here, but for both the Summit 2020 and the Dev Week, just go to, if you know about the Cold Fusion portal, go to the Cold Fusion portal, which is coldfusion.adobe.com. And at the top of the portal, there's a link for videos, or go to coldfusion.adobe.com/videos. And you'll find, for now, the Dev Week and the CF Summit 2020. And soon you'll find this CF Summit 2021 videos offered there as well. And again, we'll try to review briefly some of those key features, and especially the less key new features, just so that at least you're aware of these things, aware of the opportunities, aware of the issues, for you to go look into these things more on your own. And the slides for this talk are available online now, or you can get them later. They're at my site, carehart.org/presentation. So, yep, if you want, you can go ahead and grab those and follow along. And let me say a couple things in that regard. One is, I do offer a lot of information. I offer a lot of links, so you can go learn more. You might find this stuff by Googling it, but sometimes you won't. So if you are interested in what I have to share, I'll give you the link. And I don't expect you to write it down. Just go get the slides. And at the bottom right corner of all my slides is my site, carehart.org. So just go there. When you think about it, go there, get the presentation, PDFs, and eventually when the recordings are available, I'll post that. And this is also an opportune moment for me to say that unlike our keynote, which was very pretty, lots of pictures, I know that people will take these slides as the PDF and look at them later, and they may not want to listen to the hour-long recording. So I provide a lot of information on the slides. It's a different style, I know. Some people are more show me pretty pictures and maybe read a script, whereas I'm more, nope, let's show the information and we'll talk about it. So anyway, that's the way I roll. All right, so as far as finding out more about CF 2021, you can see that there are hundreds of pages of docs for CF 2021. Seriously, hundreds hundreds of pages, and they nearly all have demo code. So that's another reason why I'm not focused on the details of these things or demoing everything, because trust me, there's plenty of demo code out there. Now, during the pre-release, it was one big, huge PDF, and they folded into the docs online. So that's what you want to go look at. And I did a post at the time, as did Adobe, that listed links to the docs. And so if you just go to this blog post of mine from back in November when CF2021 came out, November of 2020 is when CF2021 came out, I listed there all the new features and links to the docs for each of those features. So again, you can find it on your own, but if you want like a table of contents, there's one. Adobe did one, Sarah Grosh did one, similar sort of thing. I had done mine the day before talking about what was going to be coming out, and then they released it the next day. So anyway, and then if you go to the docs, there's a what's new page, or a section of the docs, and there's the link to the what's new. And again, it too lists all the new features and the links to all the different subsections of the docs. Really tremendous. Don't miss that. So many of us want to just open a thing and start playing with it, right? But just read the docs. There's so much great information in the docs. You may be blown away. And I'll share, again, other resources as we go through this talk. Just quickly about myself, some people wonder, when a presenter is presenting, who are they? I don't presume that everybody knows who I am. Who are you, Charlie? Well, I have been in the CF world, for a long time, and I focus just on CF server troubleshooting. I don't do development. I don't build apps. I just do server troubleshooting. Been doing that for 15 years. And I'm an independent consultant. I work for myself. I assist organizations of all sizes and various experience levels, and I work remotely, of course. That's been a blessing, that my work didn't really change at all in the nature of what's going on in the last couple of years. I've been working remotely, glad to be able to help people who have to work remotely by a shared desktop. And I solve most problems in less than an hour, and I teach you as we go. So my goal is to help you understand this stuff, not just fix the problem and leave, but kind of make it so you don't need me for that problem anymore, or maybe don't need me eventually at all. And that's cool. And I guarantee your satisfaction. So if you don't find the time valuable, you won't pay for it. And you can learn more about my rates and my approach at carehart.org/consulting. To be clear, I'm not selling anything in this talk. I'm just sharing my knowledge of what's going on in CF 2021. So this is the big picture screen that Adobe showed at CF Summit last year, and had previewed in slides prior to that. So they were focusing that the major features were improved cloud connectivity, improved support for microservices, and modernizing of CF and the platform. And they achieved those. And we'll talk briefly about those, but I want to make this point too up front. All the new features of CF 2021 are supported in standard as well as enterprise. So don't think, well, we got to get to enterprise. Nope, there's nothing that's new in 2021 that is enterprise only. There's one thing that was changed, and we'll talk about that later. That's the only thing, and it's just a pretty modest thing. So anyway, don't fret. If you're on standard, you can leverage everything we're talking about. So the big key points about the cloud support, and some of you have already heard this. And by the way, let me back up and say that when I gave this talk last year, I knew that the keynote that had preceded my talk and all our talks had covered a lot of this stuff. And this year, of course, our keynote was not that sort of thing. And I'm the first breakout. So there have been no other sessions. I looked, and not really any of the other sessions seem to be focused on Adobe or anybody else going through what's new. So again, this CF Summit, I'll just say there's no session I can point you to. That's why I started out pointing you to the CF Summit 2020 sessions. Those covered this stuff in depth. And among the things that were new that were cloud support related were cloud storage service support. So yes, we've always had AWS S3. Now we had Azure Blob, but there was new stuff about the S3 support. So definitely check that out if you're into working with S3 or Azure Blob. And there was now support for integration with message queuing, and either with AWS SQS or Azure Service Bus. And for those that are into this stuff, all you need to know is, yes, you can do it. And again, the docs have ample examples of doing all these things: SNS, notifications, and SES, email, and multi-cloud RDS support. So those that have started using cloud databases know about various relational database support concepts and options in both AWS and Azure and CF provided built-in support to connect to those as data sources. I'll show you a bit more about that in a moment. And also now support for cloud implementations of NoSQL databases. So Amazon's got DynamoDB and Azure's got Cosmos DB, and those are now natively supported from within Cold Fusion. And so again, for most people, that's all they need to hear. Show me the docs, I can read the examples, I'm good, that's cool. Then we talked about, modernization and microservice-oriented development. So there was a lot of moves supporting DevOps, and we'll talk a little bit more about these in a moment, but there's now an optional small zip, or what they call express installer, that's got a lot of advantages. We'll talk about that in a moment. Let's check this out. Related to that, there's also the option for CF to come as a nice small core engine, and if you don't need it to do anything more, it stays nice and small, starts really fast. But if you want to, you can add packages, you can add modules to it. And so we'll talk briefly about that a little bit more so you can appreciate that. And then also when you're doing especially automated deployment, you want to be able to facilitate automated configuration of admin settings. And we've always had the CAR file mechanism. Well, now we have a JSON-based admin configuration with a thing called CFSETUP. And I know that's going to sound like something familiar to folks with other experience. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then you'll see I added here last year this thing called serverless deployment by AWS LAMBDA. You see that stricken out, and we'll explain why in a moment. And then there's been substantial improvements to the PMT, the Performance Monitoring Toolset, which is a monitor that CF2018 added, and we'll talk about those improvements. And there's been improvements to the way you deploy CF on Docker. And if you didn't know it, yes, Adobe has had CF images for Docker since CF 2016 and 2018 and 2021. And the ones for 2021 are improved and keep improving with each update. So again, we'll talk about those things a little bit more later. As far as other major features, just for you to be aware, why should I move to 2021? Or if I move there, what can I take advantage of? Or what's the thing that's going to make me want to make that move? For some people, this is the thing that's going to make them want to make that move. SAML support. Yeah, so built into Cold Fusion 2021, single sign-on, configuring CF as either an IDP, an identity provider, or a service provider, SP. So if you're into the SAML world, you know what those mean. Knock yourself out, go have fun. And it's really simple. And if you look at, if you just Google Cold Fusion 2021 SAML, the first article that'll come up is either the docs or an article that an Adobe person did. And it was a very simple, gentle introduction of starting out with no experience. And within just a few minutes of reading it and just a little bit of working with Okta, in their example, they showed creating an account in Okta, creating a identity provider account in Okta, and then configuring CF to talk to it. And it's like 5 lines of code. I'm not kidding. It's like 5 lines of code. So go check that out if you're interested in that. More NoSQL support. CF now supports MongoDB natively. And again, that's not even about cloud. That's if you want to have it running locally or in your network, you can now connect to MongoDB like any other database. And I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of language features and enhancements to functions and scripts and tags. And we'll talk more about those in a bit. I mean, like I said, see the CF Summit 2020 sessions and the docs for much more on that. So moving on to the hidden gems, first focused on this area of installation, administration, configuration, and monitoring. Let me say, some people might wonder, why are you doing that? Why don't you go right to the developer stuff? Well, some people are indeed only developers, but even those developers end up usually having to install and configure CF, even if it's some local copy. And I get it, some people don't. Or they use Docker and they don't do any install at all. Well, I'm not going to talk just about installing, I'm also talking about configuring. And you might still want to configure your container in the ways I'm going to talk about. So let's just get this out of the way. And if you have CF running, you might want to monitor it. So that's the stuff that's covered in this section. And then there's some aspects of administrative capabilities that influence what CF can do and how you might architect things. So it is worth it for even developers to be aware of this stuff. So let's just cover this first, then we'll get to the developer stuff, I promise. All right, so I mentioned earlier that there's this new Express installer option. It's really a zip installer. The term Express can have some bad connotations for people who've been around CF for a long time. There was a CF Express many years ago, probably a couple decades ago, and it was a very crippled version of CF. That's not this. This is just a very small, lightweight core engine. And I want to clarify that you can still use the traditional full, or they say GUI, graphical user interface, GUI installer. That's still available. And it may be the best choice for most people. So don't presume you should use the zip installer. In fact, I see in the community a lot of people getting confused because somehow they get led to believe that the zip installer is the way to go, and they get that, and it doesn't do stuff the way they expect, and it doesn't work the way they're used to. Well, let's talk about the zip approach. So with that zip, you would just go to the Adobe website where they have these things, and you would download the zip, and you'd unzip that zip, and then there's inside of it another zip. You unzip that. And then there's a CF install SH or BAT file. That CF install is in the ColdFusion bin of that zip. And it then prompts you to configure some things that have to be done, like accepting the license agreement and optionally enabling a service and some other stuff. So I'll leave you to check that stuff out on your own. Something that's not so obvious is that if you run this Express installer on a machine that's not yet ever run any CF, well, some things aren't going to work until you first run that Visual C++ redistributable. And any of you that have ever installed ColdFusion, you know that the full installer, the first thing it does is says, oh, I see you haven't installed the Visual C++ redistributable. We need that for certain features. You got to run that first. Well, the zip approach, there's no installer, there's no mechanism. So you have to know to do that. It's indicated in the docs, but again, nobody tends to notice the docs. So I'm pointing these things out. One other thing is that when you use this Express approach, those who've installed CF know that the first time you launch the admin, it goes through this migration wizard and offers to pull in admin settings from any earlier version you have on the same machine. Well, the Express installer approach doesn't do that. So just be aware, these are things that for some people, they're the right way to go because it's automated things and they want it to be minimal. But for other people, they're used to things working a certain way and they go, hey, this doesn't work the way I expect. So there's more docs about the Express installer, and there's a big long URL. So again, if you're coming late to this talk, the slides for this presentation with all these big long URLs are on my website. Look at the bottom right corner, carehart.org. Just go to the presentation section, and the very first presentation right now, the latest one I've given is this talk, and there's the link to the PDF. So you can get all these URLs and all these bullets, and you can read about them later. Now, something new since the talk I gave last year is I did a presentation earlier this year called Installing CF2021 Choices, Challenges, and Solutions. So I spent 45 minutes to an hour talking about not only the zip installer, but also the GUI installer and things that you get asked during both of them, that if you're new to installing CF, or let's say you've not installed CF for several years, you've been running on an old version of CF, or somebody else installed the CF and you've never looked at it for a long time, go watch that presentation. I'll cover this in a lot more depth. And there's the link directly to that presentation. No questions, okay. And let me clarify too that the Adobe folks have said they will put any questions into the Zoom chat. We as presenters see a Zoom chat. So if you ask questions, they'll get relayed to us. I'll try to keep an eye on other comments as well, but it's a little hard, and I'm just going to rely on any questions being guided through the Zoom chat. All right, so now moving on to this aspect of how the CF's made smaller, this Express zip approach and the Docker images are now really small, down to nearly 150 meg only. 150 meg. We're used to being nearly a gig for the ColdFusion installers. So what it is that they implement a core package or a core engine with some core packages by default. And then you have the option to install other packages and modules. So again, the full installer installs all the packages. And that's why for most people, look, if you don't care about the size, you're just used to CF being the size that it is, do the full installer. But if you want to tweak and tune and fine tune things, then this zip installer and the Docker images are both a lot smaller. So the disk space has been reduced by 300%. The startup time and the memory have been reduced substantially. And again, you can read more about that package manager capability in the docs. As for adding and removing packages, let me just tell you, you can do it either of three ways. There's a command line, there's an admin interface feature, and in the Docker images, there's a way to pull in the configuration, the packages to be used as environment variables. So quickly, at the command line, there's a CFPM, so CFPM BAT or CFPM SH, and it's in the CFusion bin folder of whatever instance you're running. And you can run it interactively, where you start it and then do a bunch of commands, or you can just provide the command, CFPM do something. CFPM, do something. So again, see that docs page or the help for the command line interface. And check this out. There's also a feature with that CFPM tool, check this out, to scan your code to identify and even optionally choose to install the packages you would need for the code you've written. So yeah, that's pretty cool. You don't have to think, do I need this module and then that module? Nope, just tell the tool to scan your code and it'll say, you need these modules. Pretty cool stuff. Now, some of you are going to go, yeah, well, it doesn't work for us because we're offline. We're in a environment where we can't get access to the internet. That stuff is great, but it doesn't work for us. No, time out. There's a download repo command in the CFPM that will, when you're on the internet, pull down the entire repo of available modules, and then you can move that into the environment that you want to work on, and you'd be able to use that. So they've thought of that. Then I mentioned that besides the tool, the command line tool, there's also in the administrator a new package manager section. So if you look in the CF2021 admin, look on the bottom left, you'll see a new button down there and you go, what's that? You click on that, it's the package manager. And it's got a couple different pages of packages and settings related to all this stuff. So I'll leave you to explore that. And then finally, I mentioned the Docker images. So if you use the Docker image and you want to say, I want this Docker image when I spin up a container to have these modules in it, well, there's an install modules environment variable where you provide a list of comma-separated list of package names that you want to install. And the package names are in the docs and they're in the admin and they're in the CFPM command line tool. So you can find that stuff. There's also a import modules environment instead of install modules, import modules, where you point to a file that's created by the CFPM when you've exported what packages were used in a particular instance. So again, they've thought of lots of stuff. People just don't talk about these things. You don't know it's there. So I love to point these things out, true hidden gems. All right, and now we talked about, that was packages. Now this is talking about how do you get the configuration like data sources and scheduled tasks and mappings? How do you get that to be in a better way automated? Well, there's now a CFSETUP script in not the CFusion bin, it's in config CFSETUP. I don't know why they did that, but anyway, it's in config CFSETUP, and it's called cfsetup.bat or cfsetup.sh. And yes, for those that are familiar with command box's cfconfig, it was there first. It does the job better. I get all that. This thing is not as powerful as that. You can't use this thing across multiple engines. You can't use this thing, this CFSETUP in CF2021. You can't use it with earlier versions of CF. I get that, but it does what it does, and it's great that it's built in is the point. And it is just literally a command line tool which can create a JSON config file that holds what's in the admin settings. And then you can take that JSON config file and import it into another CF server. You can import it into Docker images, build Docker build containers using that. So there's a new import CF settings environment variable where you point to the JSON file, and when the container starts, it has those settings. So you could always, in the Docker images, point to a car file if you remember what those were. They're still supported in CF2021. They're still supported by Docker images, but instead of using a car file, you can now use this new JSON config approach. And if you're interested in this subject, again, I could talk for an hour on it, and I did, and I called it migrating or comparing CF admin settings between instances, versions, and engines. And I talk about more than just this feature. In fact, I talk about more than just Cold Fusion. And I do talk about the CF config from command box, and I talk about tools like comparison tools. And by the way, these can be used for doing comparison, and especially command box CF config, very powerful comparison features. But I talk about still other comparison features if you don't use that. So again, if you're interested in this notion of transferring settings between instances of Cold Fusion, admin settings, that's what we're talking about. Check out that talk. I cover it in much more detail. Okay. Then I mentioned serverless deployment by AWS LAMBDA. And this, when it first came out in 2021, was literally about writing AWS LAMBDA functions in CFML, and that was awesome. And Brian Klaus did a talk at CF Summit last year that was awesome, and it was very compelling. And then it got pulled. Literally days after CF 2021 came out, it got pulled. And it's never been really clear what that was about. But anyway, it got pulled. And then check this out, in 2021's update 2 that came out just this past September. So 2.5 months ago, we got the AWS Lambda functionality back, except it only allows us to call AWS Lambda functions from within CFML. You have to write them in AWS supported languages. It does no longer offer the ability to write AWS Lambda functions in CFML. So very different. Not to say it's not valuable. I'm sure some people will still be valuable, but it's not the same thing. And just be aware. And I did a presentation or a blog post on that. And here's the URL for that back in October when I discovered that. And there's more about this whole concept in the docs there at that URL. Okay. Now, as far as the PMT, Performance Monitoring Toolset, a whole lot of stuff that's new and changed in that. Let me just quickly go through that. So first, the PMT was added in CF 2018. It works for both standard and enterprise. It does work with only 2018 and 2021. Doesn't work with 2016 or earlier. Anyway, among the new things, it's got support for monitoring integration of CF with cloud services and with NoSQL data sources, and that's cool. It's got more support to track whether to monitor cloud and NoSQL and even SQL database monitoring. In fact, check this out. This is kind of important. Database monitoring is off by default. That's a new behavior. And external service calls, like tracking CF HTTP calls out to other servers, that's off by default. So it's all configurable, and that detailed tracking is no longer there by default, but high-level tracking is there. So you'll see counts of how many queries you've done and counts of how many calls out to HTTPs you've done. But to see the details, you'd have to choose to enable that. So just be aware of that. It's an interesting change in the behavior. It's not taking anything away. It's just a change, and you can bring it back. There's also now more in active monitoring, so you can track sessions, you can track current sessions, you can track running async threads. Async threads was a new thing in CF 2018, and you can track that stuff if you're interested in it. I'll leave you to read more about that. And there's more tracking of system memory in the CF Server System tab. And then there's a bunch of configuration enhancements in the PMT. So this is very important. You can now update the PMT within the PMT. In CF 2018, when there was an update to the PMT, you had to know to read the tech note for Cold Fusion's update. You had to know to get the jar file for the update. You had to know to run it from the command line. It was pretty unfortunate. In 2021, when you go to the PMT, in the PMT, in its settings server updates page, there's a feature just like in CF admin to update itself. And you'll see there's an option to enable auto check when you log into the PMT, and it'll say, hey, there's a new update. And there's also an option in both to set an email address so that you get notified when it detects there's a new update available. So again, check those things out in the PMT and in CF itself. And there's improved data store connection information, like if you need to connect to the PMT data store by HTTPS, that's now supported. If you need to add authentication, that's now supported. There's more control over deleting data from the data store. The data store is where the information that gets tracked gets stored, and it's a elastic cache data source, if I remember correctly. There's also improvements to handling alerts that are raised if alert conditions arise. And then there's also now the ability to only capture details for requests that exceed a given duration. And the default is to capture all. But if you wanted to say, I only want to see the really slow stuff, you could do that. So check that out if that interests you. Now, moving on to the Docker images. I said that the Docker images have been around since CF 2016. They have been updated with 2021 and with each update to CF. Update 1 and Update 2 had new images. That's the cool thing about Docker, is that there'll be a new image with a new tag, and that's the way it works. These images, again, are half the size and start twice as fast as the prior images for 2018 and 2016. There's those new environment variables that I mentioned earlier. And check this out. There's also an import CF settings passphrase if you want to encrypt that JSON file so that people can't just open it and look at it. There is that. And there's still more environment variables as of Update 2. You can name what kind of profile, meaning production, development, staging, QA. There's also a deployment type, which is production development, production plus secure profile. And then there's the allowed admin IP list. So again, these are just ways that the Docker image is expanding to make it more configurable via environment variables instead of having to worry about configuring CAR files or JSON config files. Now, this is potentially important to some people. The CF Docker images are now available on Docker Hub. Yay, finally. And Amazon ECR, excuse me. So you can just go to Docker Hub, search for Cold Fusion, and it'll be among the top results that you find. And I did a blog post pointing that out with some more details, so you can check that out. Okay. Other admin changes to be aware of. I mentioned you can deal with new kinds of data sources. There's Mongo support, a lot of config settings, cloud services, cloud configuration stuff. I'm pointing out here that there's an add button, and when you click that add button, it opens up more config settings. So don't just look at the screen and go, oh, I know what it does or doesn't do. Click the add button, try to add one, you'll see the powerful stuff that's in there. And there's even the notion of a config alias that you can use later in configuration. So I'll leave you to dig into that. Again, just check all that stuff out. It's a lot more interesting than most people probably realize. I mentioned the support for cloud databases. Look at the things that are now supported. These are cloud-oriented databases that are supported in Cold Fusion 2021. Might interest some of you. And then just some miscellaneous remaining admin changes. This is important to some people. The max metaspace JVM arg that was in CF 2018 and 2016 is no longer there. And that's something I'd lobbied for, others do too. And I've got a blog post where I explain why we should generally not be bothering setting it and why a lot of people were getting errors because they were hitting it and it was artificially low limit, and chasing what the size should be wasn't really the right answer for most people. Just take it out and the JVM will just use available memory, and usually you don't need a lot of metaspace. So anyway, there's more discussion of that, and the fact that it was removed in 2021 is now also added as a comment there. For those that pay attention to things, like if you have Fusion Reactor watching what's going on in Cold Fusion, you might have seen these heartbeat things happening all the time. And those used to be called _connector. And that was conflicting with some people who might have had a folder called connector. So now Adobe renamed it to __CF _connector _heartbeat __. So hopefully that won't conflict with anybody else. And you can see those set in the workers properties and in the web XML. If you get interested in changing that, that's where those are documented. There's also additional SAML configuration stuff. We talked a bit about that earlier. Also notice that the SAML stuff can be done in the application CFC instead. You don't have to do it in the admin. That's kind of cool. And then check this out. There's new support for the CF distributed caching feature, which was new in 2018. There's now support for AWS Elasticache and Azure Redis. And as far as I know, those are the only things that are, quote, new or changed in 2021 that are enterprise only. So the distributed caching is enterprise only, and these are new options for that distributed caching. And then Azure Redis Cache has been added as a CF session storage option. Again, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but CF 2016 added the ability to store your Cold Fusion sessions in Redis. Yeah. And 2021 lets you also point to Azure Redis as a place to store your CF sessions. So if you didn't catch that CF could now store sessions other than just in memory, this isn't new. This is just another option. So check that out on your own or reach out to me and we can talk more about that. And then there's new admin API features added for almost everything that's been added new. So just these are things that were available and related to admin related stuff. And then just want to talk about the shoe to drop to some people's minds is this new activation feature. When you put in a CF 2021 license, that license will need to be activated. That we never had before in prior versions of CF. And that activation, of course, is over the internet. And if you don't have internet access, you might think, well, I can't do that. You need to do it. And there is support for that. There is an admin section at the bottom left to manage all this stuff. And I'll just say the docs discussing this talk about how to deal with if you're offline. And then as far as the tracking of your use of a license and how many servers are using it and that sort of stuff, you can also now track how many Docker images are using that production license key. So anyway, check that stuff out. Cool thing though, keep this in mind. If you're just doing the development edition or the trial edition, you don't need to put in a license, so activation doesn't apply to you. This is just if you put in a standard or enterprise license key. That does now need to be activated. And again, that's discussed in the docs, and you can find that readily by just saying Cold Fusion 2021 activation, and you'll find discussion of it. So let's move on now to the developer features. So don't forget that among the new features are things that would interest you as a developer. So the cloud services, NoSQL, serverless, SAML, Docker improvements, they can make your life easier, but there is more. So core language enhancements, let me just say that Rakshith, who was the product manager at the time, he did a session last year on this with demos. And remember, the docs have demos, and these things improve how CFML can be written. So there's support for parallel programming in arrays and structs and queries. There's support for immediately invoked function expressions. There's support for iterable objects with spread and rest operators for those familiar with those concepts from other languages. There's iterator support in CFCs. There's support for static fields and static methods in CFCs. There's an identity operator for testing if items are the same type. And that's not all. Let's keep going. There's shorthands for writing properties. There's the option to merge structs. There's destructuring assignment, which again is a concept that might make sense from other languages you've worked with. That's now supported by CFML for structs and arrays. And even switch cases, which always had to be static case values, now you can do dynamic case values for those that like that sort of thing. And these are just some of the many aspects of how CF and CFML have been modernized over the 25 years that CF's been going. And I did a talk earlier this year called Cold Fusion at 25, More Modern Than Most Realize. And again, you can go see that presentation. You can either watch the recording or just look at the slides. And let me just say that if you're interacting with potential employers or colleagues who might want to do some work on, you wish they could do some work on CF and they push off on it because it's all about tags. No, that's not true. You don't have to write any tags anymore. Since CF11, you could write the entire app in script if you wanted to. And that's just one of dozens of things that I talk about in the presentation. Fat arrow functions, just all kinds of stuff. It's amazing how much CFML is modernized in Cold Fusion and also in Lucy, and I talk a little about that in the presentation. All right, moving on. There's also language-oriented stuff, case-sensitive structs. That could be important to you. There is now the ability to declare that a struct you're creating is going to be case-sensitive or ordered case-sensitive. And you can even do it with some implicit notation when you build the struct. So again, I'm not going to show examples. Just check out the docs. The point is CFML is evolving. And ordered structs are not new. Ordered structs were added in 2016, and there was a nomenclature for doing that implicitly. And it can get confusing because ordered isn't the same as sorted, but it's about the insertion order. And there are functions like struct to sorted that were added and struct sort that goes back a way long time. And these are all different. So I just want to tell you to look into this stuff if you're concerned about struct, key, value, ordering, and stuff like that. Check this stuff out. And there's even examples at this bit.ly URL that I provided. As far as changed functions and tags, there's new bcrypt and scrypt functions for creating password hashes, and scrypt adds even more. And these weren't in the beta doc, so some people may have missed them. Check this out. When you're doing a CF query or the equivalent in script of a query execute, you can declare whether the thing that comes back is just a query, or is it an array, or is it a JSON-based array? And is it a struct or a JSON-based struct? Again, that wasn't originally documented, but it is supported. So yeah, you can have CFML return other than a query in the CFML. And if you're just returning that, as a method that you're calling from some API, that's pretty cool. There's also new member functions and methods available with things related to arrays, push, pop, shift, unshift. There's improvements related to strings as collections. I'll leave you to look into that. There's a new start argument for the replace and replace no case functions. It could be useful for some people. And there's enhancements to nested CF saved content in script, which might be valuable to some people. So I'll leave you to look into that. And then there's label support for loops, which might, again, some people like that stuff. Some people find it annoying or confusing. But anyway, there is support for that. And there's support for base 64 encoding now in the binary encode and decode functions. You can also set the time zone for all requests in your application CFC. There's a whole bunch of new application CFC things that you can set that are related to these new features of 2021. And it also, check this out, 2021 lets you now literally create and execute Java within CFML. Yeah, you can put Java right in the code. You don't have to worry about creating an equivalent create object that points to some Java thing and then call its methods. You can just put the Java into CFML if you want to. Again, not everybody's cup of tea. Some people are going to say, no, don't do that. And it also supports implementing, extending Java interfaces. And I just want to clarify that CFML has had support for Java since not 6, 4. 4.01 added, or 4.51, I think it was, added support for calling Java objects from CFML. And when CF6 came out, it rewrote CF on Java, and CF10 added still more stuff like loading classes, not by putting them in a library, but by putting them in an application mapping of CFC, of Java mappings for class loading. That's cool stuff. So CF's evolved over time with regard to Java. And that's it for language enhancement. So wrapping up to some other considerations, we got, let me see, about 10 minutes left. So some other considerations, deprecated features, compatibility issues, changes from updates, and more. So as far as deprecated features, well, some of you just know, if you Google Cold Fusion deprecated, the first thing that comes up is this page called deprecated features. So go check it out. It tells you what's changed and over each release what's been changed. And as far as 2021 is concerned, here's what's been removed, which I don't think is going to make anybody cry. Corba's been removed. Lifecycle data service has been removed. Flex has been removed. FlashPaper has been removed. Schedule, curiously, CF schedules on Misfire now has been removed. That was kind of weird. But anyway, other than that, there seems to be nothing deprecated or retired. There don't seem to be any new reserved words in 2021. Now let's talk about migration issues. It does seem, from my experience, that there'll be few problems you'll encounter going from 2018 to 2021. But of course, with every version, there can be issues, and it depends on where you're coming from. Like if you're coming from 2016, that's different. If you're coming from 11, that's different. 10, and I work with people that are coming from even 9 and 8. Trust me, they're doing it. And there's various reasons. Maybe security issues have scared them into finally getting straight and getting on a later version. And so now they're dealing with that. Well, I talk about these sort of things in each Hidden Gems talk. I would say in that talk, here's the compatibility issue differences from the prior version in the new version. And then I even gathered them up in one talk called What Was New in CF 10, 11, and 2016 that you may have missed for back in the 2018 timeframe. I haven't updated that, but that talk is out there. But then more recently, I did another talk, and I'll show you that in just a moment. Hold that thought. I wanted to mention that a potentially big deal for some people, and this is new in 2021, there's a new date format mask of capital D. And you might go, so I don't care about that. Well, the deal is the capital D means what's the day in the year for a given date. And there's others, and the difference with the capital M and capital Y aren't really clear compared to lowercase m and lowercase y. But if you've been using capital D or capital DD all this time in your code where a lowercase d or DD should have been used, well, that was just ignored. And it produced the same result as the lowercase d. But oh my gosh, in 2021, that code would now return the day in the year. So here's an example. If I did a date format of this date with MMDDYY, in prior versions, that would produce, 11/23/2020. There you go. But in 2021, look at what this produces, 11/3/28/2020. And that's pretty scary, right? So that's a feature. It was intentional. And there was a fix made available in late November. So just weeks, days and weeks after CF2021 came out. And that fix was later folded into update 1 that came out in March of this year. Now that fix requires you to put in a JVM argument to revert the behavior. So beware of that. It doesn't revert the behavior automatically. You have the right to revert the behavior by putting in the JVM argument, which is this. And I'll just say I've got a blog post that discusses this with a lot more detail for those that care. All right. And then finally, last thing about compatibility is if you're using trusted authentication for data sources from CF to SQL Server, you need to add a new connection string value of authenticated method equals NTLM. Don't know why that's necessary, but it is, and there you go. As far as more on migrating from different versions of CF to 2021, I did a talk just last week, a couple weeks ago, called Migrating Apps to Cold Fusion 2021 from earlier versions, and you can go watch the whole presentation where I get into this stuff in much more detail. As far as the updates, again, update 1 came out in March. It was the last update for CF 2016 in March, and there was also an update for 2018 at the same time in March, and it had security fixes, bug fixes, and support for new things like Red Hat 8.3 and Wildfly 23 and Tomcat 9043 and so on. So if you're interested in those things, you want to be on update 1. And here's the tech note for update 1. Then update 2 came out in September of this year, and it also had an update for 2018. And it would, by the way, incorporate update 1. So they're cumulative. You just do the latest one. And they also came out with a new CF installer, which had CF 2021 updates 1 and 2 pre-installed, and the JVM updated. And that's nice. And this update in 2021 also added security fixes, bug fixes, some updates to CFSETUP, and more new version features. So check it out, you guys that are on Mac. Yes, Big Sur support was added in update 2, and Tomcat was updated to 9050. And I know that now, I forget what the next one is, but the next version of Mac has already come out, and no, it's not yet supported, but they're working on it. And so they'll come out. We'll see how long it'll take. Anyway, here's the update tech note for update 2. There is, listen, this is important. If you do, if you do update 2, there's a query of queries bug. And here's the tracker page for getting a fix, a jar that you need to put in to your installed CF once you've updated it with update 2. And the tech note has comments from me and others telling you what you need to do. So check that out if you're going to go to update 2. Pretty much everybody should do that, that hot fix. So anyway, I got to move on. I mentioned that also update 2 added some Docker image environment variables. Java updates, I'll just tell you there have been updates to Java, and here's articles where I talk about each update and when things are important. And April 2021, there were particularly important aspects of the new JVM about TLS, calling out to TLS 1.1 or 1.0 servers. So check that out. And you generally should be updating your JVM because it's what Cold Fusion relies on. And I have a table of what versions of CF support what versions of Java, and you can look at that later. As for the remaining topics, back in the pre-2020 version of this talk, I also covered updates to libraries, what's new in standard versus enterprise, prices and licensing and life support, CF Builder 2021, and I knew that I wouldn't have time to get into those, so go watch that version or see the slides for that. And as was mentioned in the keynote today, just briefly, CF Builder 2021 is still planned for next year. It's going to be built on VS Code, and that's all we know for now. That is literally all we know. So go check out the talk for those details. And then as far as other information, just real quickly wrapping up, check this out. The Cold Fusion Security Code Analyzer now works with CF 2021 Standard and Developer. It previously only worked since CF 2016 with Enterprise. That's pretty cool. So you can do security code analysis from CF Builder. Even if you don't use CF Builder for anything else, use it for this. And I've got a blog post where I talk about this stuff. And then CF 2021's lockdown guide did come out finally in December. And here's my blog post talking about that. And the Adobe CF certification is now available for just $149. And it's got hours of training. And it's not so much anything about new in 2021, I don't think. It came out before 2021, but it came out in like 2019, I think. So it's still modern, good stuff. Nolan Irk wrote most of it and did most of the recorded presentations. So anyway, you can sign up for that certification and the training, and there's my blog post about that. All right, so in summary, lots of changes, right? I counted about 60 major and minor changes across all these things that we discussed, and I just hope that you're motivated to consider 2021 and informed about what to consider and take advantage of and understand if and how it might work for you and where things stand as of now. So at least you'll speak more confidently and competently if anybody asks you any questions. And as far as other questions you may have, I'll look in the moments we have left to see if there's any remaining follow-up questions. Yeah, I got a couple minutes. And here's my contact information again, my email address, and all my ways to reach me on Slack. So update 2 broke many things, Paul said. Well, really, it primarily broke the query of queries. And what's interesting is that some people said, well, it wasn't query of queries that broke, it was my array function that broke, it was my whatever thing that broke. Well, just beware, sometimes that thing broke because a prior query of queries produced some result that wasn't expected, and that may be what really led to it. I think the new version, geez, I don't know what that means. And I'm reading for the top down, so I may miss some of the jokes. CF report, yeah, that's right. There was a CF report issue. Thank you for pointing that out. I forgot about that. And there is a hot fix for it. And you can reach out to Adobe or me. You know, I'll find it. I'm sorry, I didn't think to put that in there. I see some people saying the live stream turned off. Well, all this will have been recorded, and you'll be able to watch the recording if you missed any part of this.